Hello, I'm Eric Snodgrass, and thank you for watching today's long-range forecast video brought to you by Nutrien Ag Solutions. This analysis is being provided for perspective only, and any decision made based upon this presentation is the sole responsibility of the person making the decision. Finally, please remember that all long-range weather forecasting is speculative by nature. Well, today's video is going to have two parts to it. I'm going to start off the video by focusing on both near and long-term threats here in the United States, including a discussion about some very heavy precipitation coming in the next 10 days, and then a highly anomalous temperature pattern at least through about October 8th. After that, the second part of this video is going to focus on South America. We're going to really discuss what controls the strength of the Brazilian monsoon and precipitation across that region. So feel free to fast forward and move the video around to see what you want to see in this one. But we're going to start here in the U.S. One of the main storylines we've had over the last several days has been the development of this pattern that's been featuring a larger ridge that's setting up here over the southeast, keeping things relatively dry and quite warm. A very active storm track through the northern part of the United States that's coming out of this developing deep trough in the western U.S. This particular flow pattern is going to certainly pump a lot of moisture right into this area, and there's going to be a kind of a semi-permanent boundary setting up between those last two lines I just drew, and we're going to be seeing some very heavy precipitation, especially as you move out of Kansas into parts of Missouri, Nebraska, Iowa, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. So we're going to talk about that first. Second thing we're going to talk about is the upcoming temperature pattern, because it as well, due to that deeper trough and that highly amplified pattern featuring that ridge over the southeast, is going to be bringing in much below average temperatures to parts of the northern prairies of the United States and the Canadian prairies as well. And we're also going to have a discussion there about our snow potential, not only in the mountains, but getting down into the lower elevations. We need to know when this pattern is going to break and what the consequences of this pattern mean, especially for our late planted crops. We're going to talk about that as well. Well, over the last 24 hours, we've seen some very heavy rainfall that's moved through parts of Arkansas, Oklahoma, and Kansas, and also some pretty nasty storms that went through parts of Iowa, southern Minnesota, and Wisconsin. Picked up 113 reports of severe weather, and I'll show you some of the details of that in tomorrow's video. But on the bigger side of things here, the bigger picture, I should say, over the last 14 days, this corridor here and this corridor in through there, plus Imelda, which came in through here, has been extremely wet. And why I'm showing you this is if you just look at this compared to what you just saw, there's same region that's been so wet is about to pick up a lot more precipitation, and this is not good. This is just another in a long line of stresses to the crops growing in the midsection of the United States. So again, that's the last 14 days departure from normal precipitation, and a lot of these places are well over 5 inches of additional rainfall over that time period. So looking forward, what is the flow doing that's getting this set up? Well, I think looking at Friday's weather map, which is what you're looking at here, is going to tell us what to expect. You see, in general, higher atmospheric pressure is sitting here, the flow around it being clockwise, running into a boundary that's going to be stretched into this area. So what ends up happening here is we get flow that looks something a bit more like this, and that warm, moist air hits this boundary and runs up over the top of it, lifting the air in the atmosphere, producing clouds and precipitation. Until we break down that ridge over the southeast and shed this deeper trough that's sitting here, we can't get rid of this pattern. And as a consequence, over the coming days, we're expecting a lot of precipitation. This is just through the next 5 days, so getting you through Sunday evening. We can see from the National Blended Model exactly where the heavy precipitation corridors are going to be. Certainly following the storm track doing this, but right in through this area. Again, parts of Kansas, Missouri, Iowa, northern Illinois, southern Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan here have the potential to pick up several more inches of rainfall. And as you just saw, that particular area has been relatively hard hit. Now, in the depth of that trough that is developing in the western United States, with the storm track doing this and then lifting to the north and east, we're going to be bringing in enough cold air to put some snow down in our mountains here, but also some snow that could potentially get into the prairies here, the lower elevations, out onto the plains. And I'll talk about this more tomorrow, but the risk for snowfall here in parts of Montana, parts of Alberta, and Saskatchewan, getting into the, again, out onto the plains here, is relatively high given the cooler weather that's in place. Now, don't look at this map and immediately pull off numbers. We're just kind of trying to identify where that potential storm track is with bringing in some snow. And we're also going to have to talk about the potential for even, I think, some more snow as we get out here a little bit farther for bringing it maybe even a little bit further into the United States. I got to do more analysis on that before I can give you a solid kind of picture. But over the next 10 days, I'm tending to agree here with the GFS model. It's very similar to the ECMWF in that we're kind of painting this corridor through here wet as well as this one as well. And these storm systems are all moving toward the north and east. So drier risks over the south, as it would be normal for this time of year, drier in California. But in that center part of the country, our flooding threat is very, very high moving forward. Now, in last week's video, I made a case, I said, for October to not see such high precipitation extremes. Remember, this forecast is largely over the next 10 days here at the beginning of my video, and we're focusing on this near-term pattern. I'm not backing away from some of the key factors that I saw in the forecast that I produced last week, calling for maybe the middle of October, featuring hopefully a less amplified and drier pattern, which would be good. But certainly over the next 7 to 10 days, the rainfall that's coming in, well, it's going to be hitting a region that we already have. We'll just kind of draw a V around it here. Already have these major soil moisture anomalies, much greater than normal. So even if we do not see October being super wet, any rainfall inside of this corridor right in through here is going to continue to produce flooding problems, and that's a message we carried last week. So why do I say that about October? Well, let me show you what the flow pattern's doing. Certainly by the end of this week and weekend, we get into this highly amplified, look at this big ridge, deep trough over the west, and then big ridge over the southeast. This pattern, which appears to be blocked up both in Alaska and Greenland, but it's not, is going to temporarily produce a lot of adverse weather between the trough and ridge. You know that, between the trough and ridge right in through here. But why I think as we get out into October, things are not going to be as anomalous and therefore not as wet and cool is because the patterns advertising here, maybe this high over low setup by the time we get out past the 8th and 9th of the month in the Pacific Ocean. So specifically, the jet stream's got to flow around this ridge and around this trough, and that tends to flatten the flow out across the central United States, which means less of an anomalous or highly active pattern at that point. But we need to see what that means in terms of temperatures as well. So let's get into that discussion here. I'm talking about these patterns. First, I just want to reiterate, I don't see much of a change overall in my forecast for the middle of the month of October, which is what I pulled out. This is the same graphic I showed you last week. I certainly do see the active pattern when it's doing this, hitting the west coast at times, west coast of the United States hitting, and Canada at times being wetter. We've already seen this play out down here with the wetter than average conditions in parts of Arizona, but calling this area right in through here on the drier side of things, our longer range models are still advertising that for the middle of the month. The most difficult place to forecast right now, though, is the north central plains and the Canadian prairies, getting over to parts of Minnesota and Wisconsin as well. That is going to be the area that no one's going to have much confidence in a longer term forecast at this point. And I think the only other wild card here is going to be what happens down here in the southeast. Although they're dry now, by mid-October we do need to be watching some tropical activity. So let's transition to talk about that in the near term. Jerry, nothing really to talk about here. Lorenzo, staying out to open ocean. Karen is our main focal point at this point. And right now we see that by the time we get to the end of this week and the start of the weekend, Karen is forecast to move north after it went over Puerto Rico last night and stall a bit right here. And as a result of stalling out, we might allow for the steering current to push Karen back over toward the west a bit. It's going to be a very tricky forecast. I won't have much detail on this until we get into the weekend to see if some of the European ensemble members are correct in bringing Karen back into this direction after stalling for a bit right here. So honestly, much more important to hear me talk about Karen next week, as the details right now are just, well, they're not well defined. So to give you a forecast of Karen with confidence is not something I can do at this point. I will tell you this, in the Gulf of Mexico right now, the ocean temperatures are quite warm, and as a consequence, should anything form there, Karen or otherwise, we could potentially produce a storm system that gets pulled into the mid part of the U.S. that could be, and off to the southeast, that could be substantial in terms of its ability to put down a lot of rainfall. Just saying, the Gulf of Mexico is primed as we move into the second half of this hurricane season. So now our attention turns over to temperatures, and I love this graphic put up by the Climate Prediction Center here. identifying areas where we're seeing risk of temperature problems. It's not only out here to the 2nd through the 8th of October where we're watching. It's in the near term as well. But temperatures in Montana are going to be much, much, much below average for the foreseeable future. Looking at a more moderate risk of having much below average temperatures, you can see that we're outlining this time period from the 2nd to the 4th. We need to be watching for low pressure systems moving, dragging some cold air behind them, and even all the way out to the 8th, you can see they've identified that one region as well. Now, the reason why we have to have a discussion about this is given the late plant this year, what does this mean in terms of crop progress in that area? Because we've got really good model agreement that over the next several days, while it's going to be much above average in terms of temperatures here, we are not accumulating heat north of that line that I just drew there. Very cold. And when the pattern really sinks into that highly amplified nature into next week, where we're building the heat here, but look, we are off my color bar in parts of Montana, which means it's going to be 20 degrees or colder than average in that area. We need to understand when these systems are going to emerge into the Central Plains and what that may mean for dropping off temperatures. Just to give you some dates to be thinking about here, I'm thinking about October 3rd, 4th, and 5th, and also October 8th and 9th as getting these pulses of colder air that will be moving through the northern plains. You can see the end of it here once we get out to days 11 through 15, really starting to see a much different pattern after we get past the 8th and the 9th of the month setting up across the United States. All right, so it's highly anomalous now, but it looks as though it's going to be smoothing out a bit once we get out to the 8th or 9th. Now, this gets me thinking a lot about corn. This was just released on Monday. Many of you I know have seen this, but I'm mostly concerned about our northern plains, so North Dakota, South Dakota, also Minnesota and Wisconsin, as if any place at this time of year is normally getting a frost, which we are also forecasting, we need to know what percent of that corn crop is going to be potentially impacted by it. So you can see here we're looking at the percent dented on the September 22nd report, and I'm just going to show you something here. Over the next 9 days, see the map at the bottom there, over the next 9 days, the numbers that you see in black, and they're also color-coded for you, is what we're anticipating in terms of our accumulation of growing degree day units. Now, looking up several papers, I looked up to see how many GDUs need to accumulate between when you start dent and then you get to black layer. And the lowest values I could find were somewhere around 300 GDUs. And what my point here is just to show you that over the next 9 days, when we will be seeing frost hitting this section of the United States, over the next 9 days, we're not even getting anywhere close to accumulating the heat that's needed for the part of the crop that is still needing it to finish. Now, just plucking those numbers off, 41% of North Dakota's corn still isn't to dent, 29% of South Dakota, 41% of Wisconsin, 25% of Minnesota. Add all that up, that's 8.76 million acres that could be impacted by an early frost. So it's just, it is what the weather's doing. It's just the impact we have to see here, somewhere around 9 million acres potentially adversely affected by this frost that's coming in early October. Now, technically, it's a late frost for this area, as we normally get a frost there at the end of September. So I just wanted to put some numbers to this and show you that while we are accumulating big time heat down here, 200 to 400 GDUs over the next 9 days, those numbers are in some places up there in the single digits in the northern plains in terms of accumulating heat. So if we try to identify what's causing this, let me just kind of pull out a couple of things here. This highly amplified pattern is being helped along by the negative value here of the Southern Oscillation Index, although what's going on right now is that the Pacific Ocean is giving us a very interesting look. Where you see the blues in the forecast here, this is anomalously easterly winds, and where you see the reds over here, right in this area, this is anomalous westerly winds. So this is creating an area right here around the international dateline of low-level divergence in the flow. That means air sinking in this area. And one of the consequences of that is it tends to allow our jet stream to become a bit more amplified. So I'm just letting you know this is all making sense. Another factor here has to do with the Madden-Jullian oscillation, which came out of its null phase and is sitting right now and spinning in phase 1. Well, what is phase 1 correlated with this time of year? Well, you can see that it's typically correlated with a deeper trough off the west coast and ridging over the eastern part of the U.S. Even when you lag this by a couple of days, that is the pattern we tend to see. So until the MJO gets out of phase 1, You add that to the fact we've got the Southern Oscillation Index that's quite negative, which is actually behaving like El Nino, and we get this highly anomalous pattern which you see here. We can then say this, our global angular momentum, just think of that as how fast the atmosphere is moving. Well, it has since the beginning of September been tanking like this, so it's been dropping. And when you look at the correlation of global angular momentum with the flow of the atmosphere, well, normally high global angular momentum puts a big ridge here. But we have low global angular momentum. So instead of having a ridge, we have a trough coming into this area, and we have ridges where the blues are. So this is just another factor that's adding to this. And the final one has to do with what's called the Indian Ocean dipole. So what we're talking about here is the fact that there's cool water here and warm water there. And that is actually working in phase with the other three things I mentioned to give us the jet stream that's doing this. And these things are kind of all right now balancing together. They're working together. And the big question is, when do they come apart? So I'm going to tell you this. There's no point in taking a forecast right now beyond 15 days. No one will have confidence in this beyond 15 days because of all of these different things kind of right now working together. Well, if they start to separate, it's going to shatter any long-range forecast. Now, I'll tell you this. The longer-range models from the Europeans and the U.S. are actually calling for moderate temperatures across the United States through October. But I think this is mostly because those longer-range ensembles, when averaged together, are giving you an average temperature because they're so widely spread. What I'm saying is, all of these global features, which I just described to you, are kind of at an inflection point right now. They're bottoming out or peaking. And as a consequence, when they move away from their maximum positions, we're going to see big changes in the forecast. Watch these things with me in my forecast videos. When MJO gets out of phase 1, changes will happen. When we block up the North Pacific or potentially block up Greenland, change is going to happen. And we need to pay close attention actually to snow this time of year in Siberia as impacting the overall flow of the jet stream. Which feature dominates? I really don't know moving forward. So I say we've got mixed signals right now in the longer term forecast, which is why this video is not offering much for you beyond October at this point. Okay, second part of my video now. Let's talk about South America. Now, I went and I correlated the flow of the atmosphere with high yields. And this is what they need to see throughout all of this upcoming winter for us, spring and summer for South America, to get those high yields. Now the temperature pattern, the color pattern you see here is not temperatures. It's actually the flow of the atmosphere. It's where there are troughs and ridges. They need to see a very active jet stream pattern. Just like we do in the Northern Hemisphere, we don't want the atmosphere to get blocked up, and that's particularly what they see here when they have high yields. They don't have a blocked atmosphere. Stepping down, we've now gotten down here to about 3,000, 5,000 feet above our heads. What they typically get is a strong, what's called a low-level jet, a strong what's called Chaco low, and that is where over the Andes Mountains they get flow that does something like this, and around a ridge to flow that does something like that. Now again, this big South Atlantic high sitting right in this area helps to funnel moisture out of the intertropical convergence zone into this area. This is the Brazil monsoon. And if I take those drawings off there, what you end up getting at the surface is you get this area in through here of convergence, bringing in the rainfall that is necessary to grow the crops that they grow right into this area. Okay, so if that's what they need to have for an ideal monsoon to bring in precipitation, what we need to talk about at the end of this video is what upsets this, okay? Certainly, we have to wait for that circulation to start. And as I've been talking about, year-on-year vegetation health index is way down because they're dealing with drought conditions. Look at this. Going back to the beginning of June, very little rainfall has built up a sizable deficit. Now, the total precipitation they've received since June is only 11 inches, and that is 6.5 inches off of what is normal in this area. So the deficit in rainfall needs to be overcome. So a lot of times people tell me, like, well, isn't it going to be controlled by El Nino or La Nina? Well, right now, while you do see the cooler water in this area, the atmosphere is not behaving as if a La Nina is approaching. And at best this winter, due to the positive phase of the PDO, that's the warm water here, we're not going to be able to develop much of a La Nina signature. Plus, Indian Ocean dipole is going to work against that as well. And I'm sorry, but a lot of folks like to say, well, El Niños tend to produce drought in the northern part and they tend to make it very wet in Argentina. La Nina tends to make it very wet in Brazil and very dry in Argentina. Well, I know that's what we've been taught and trained to hear a lot about, but I'll tell you something. El Nino La Nina is not a major factor. It is not the dominant factor for Brazil. It's a bigger factor for Argentina, but it's not the dominant factor for Brazil. Just to give you some proof, take a look at this. Mato Grosso, you're looking here at yield anomalies versus precipitation rate, and I've color-coded the El Nino years in red and the La Nina years in blue. And you can pause the video and look at this carefully, but I'll tell you, it's a scatter plot here. There's not much correlation. Go south. Let's go down to Rio Grande do Sul. Same thing, yield anomaly in that state versus precipitation rate. And I've color-coded in red El Nino years and in blue La Nina years. And you see they mix together. There's not a strong correlation between El Nino and La Nina. So if that's the case, what ultimately determines the strength of the monsoon? And what I'll tell you is it has everything to do with the Madden-Jullian oscillation. Now here's a quick primer on that. We watch across this part of the world for areas of rising motion and sinking motion. When air goes up, clouds, precipitation, heavy rain. When it goes down, you get the opposite. We tend to see that this moves in a predictable, relatively predictable pattern out about 3 or 4 weeks, showing it moving east and then eventually west across this region. So, over the next 10 to 15 days, the MJO is going to be in phase 1, moving over into phase 2. That turns out to be a phase that's highly supportive of rainfall in this area and in this area. So we are going to be seeing over the next few days above average precipitation across much of Brazil, simply due to the fact that the MJO is helping with the Brazilians' monsoonal circulation. Now, best chances of being drier are in far eastern parts of Brazil, but overall, this is a favorable pattern. So you can even see it here in the satellite animation. Watch right in through here. See the storms popping up in the heat of the day? That is allowed by the fact that the MJO is in phase 1. So if you see it, I'll just take you back. You see all the storms popping up there. That's what the MJO being in phase 1 allows to have happen. So take a look at this. Let's see where those 8 different phases are located first of all. Now take a look at the animation that's in the upper right-hand corner. Now we have a phase diagram that's going to correspond to this animation. Phases 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. What I want you to remember is this. Phases 8, 1, and 2 are supportive of monsoonal rains. Phases 4 and 5 are not. Now when you look at this, wherever you see these colors, I know it's outgoing long-wave radiation, but understand that this is dry. And wherever you see these colors, it's wet. So phase 1, let's play this out. Phase 1 is supportive of rainfall in Brazil and not over Indonesia and parts of Australia. Well, watch, phase 2 doesn't show as supportive, but still not suppressive of rainfall here in Brazil. But you can see it moving eastward. Now look at this, phase 3. At this point, we're now starting to see very active convection happening here in the Indian Ocean. And as that happens, things begin to shut down here over Brazil. Phase 4, it now moves over Australia and Indonesia. And phase 4, look, it starts to dry out in Brazil. Phase 5, same thing. Phase 6, see the propagation here? Into 7 and 8. So phases 8, 1, and 2 are wetter in Brazil. Phases 3, 4, 5, and a little bit into 6 are drier. And normally, the MJO moves like that. So this offers some predictability for us when looking at the timing of the monsoon. So what do we have? Well, you can pause the video and look at the image that's over there on the right. It shows the same thing. Look at phases 4 and 5. Wet here and here, dry. Look at phases 1. Dry here, wet over in this area. So this is the correlation I'm trying to get us to understand so we can watch it all season long. Now we need the rainfall to come in and stick around for a while. So what's the MJO doing? Well, it's right now in phase 1, and therefore we can see that much of Brazil is on the wetter side of things. We anticipate it moving by mid-month over into phases 3 through 5. There's the potential for that, and that's why we see it drying out in this area. So what they need in Brazil is for the rain to come on and stay on and not be suppressed because they're so dry. A lot of folks are seeing, oh, we're bringing in some rain now, but is it really going to bring up the moisture levels of the soil enough to sustain us through a drier time period in mid-October? And this is the biggest question they're trying to answer in South America right now, and it's one that I'm watching every single day. And I'll keep you updated in all of our forecast content. Now, I know this video was longer, but we had a lot to cover. Hope you found it informative, but right here I'll go ahead and stop it. Hope you all have a great week. Tune in next week for our next long-range outlook, and we'll talk to you again then. Thank you.